Thanks a lot, Rodney and Karen, for joining with me today. I've been thinking a lot about the journey we've all been on together in how we can advance more productive communication and narrative in the important work we all do. Karen, can you just reflect a little bit to you about why communications matter so much and a little bit about what gets in the way?
When we first met, I think we were both experiencing, along with many other people, this phenomenon of we would communicate about the work that we were doing, and we knew that there was a lot of evidence behind what we were advocating for, and yet somehow it didn't land. So we started looking at what do other disciplines have to tell us about how do you kind of open up the mystery of how people form their thinking and their opinions. Although we might think people are open and kind of a blank slate, there's actually a lot in there when we're speaking into a person's mind. And there are all kinds of experiences and ideas and beliefs. And so when we're speaking to people, we're speaking into those shared beliefs that kind of form patterns. And when it comes to our work, there are some patterns in there, thinking patterns that are really in the way of people understanding and supporting the work we do.
Rodney, just as someone who's been, who served a very long time as a leader in human services in your own community, and reflecting on how this is translated for you and what your experiences have been on the ground, I think that would be really helpful reflection.
One of the most important things that I learned was understanding the narrative or the lived experience that people have. Because of that lived experience, people develop their own perspective, their own narrative of something. And as an organization, when you are in public administration, many times it's very easy to get caught up in the organization speak, where you see things through the lens of the organization, you see things through the federal policies and programs that you administer, and you identify success through that lens. But success through that lens is critically different from success on the ground. And then when you begin to interact with different systems on the ground, they all have their own definition of success. And so really beginning to unpack what the lived experience or the perspective of families, how they see things, how they define success, and really begin to evaluate the work that you do through that lens.
We learned pretty early on that as much as we were pulling on some very important research from organizations like Frameworks Institute and others, we were missing a bit of how to make it come alive and real for all of you on the ground. We have worked really hard to try to translate so much of that research into what it actually looks like in practice by really building our own muscle around a little bit of a framing formula, we call it, which is essentially how do we start any conversation, starting with a shared value, number one, two, showing, not telling, but showing how something works. It's often really helpful to use a metaphor that people understand how it works to make a comparison, illustrating what that looks like on the ground through stories, and not a single story, right? Multiple stories that really help people understand. So telling multiple stories of how those connections are made, and using data not as a starting point, but as an illustration point of how it all works, and then leading to solutions, whether those are in policy or practice. Let me ask Rodney if there's any specific example of your own experience where flipping that narrative or creating it just slightly differently had a different impact for you and your community.
I went to read to some homeless children one day. And before you read, they asked me to tell them who I was and what I did. And at that time, my responsibility was to make sure that families ate and that they had access to medical care, things of that nature. And it dawned on me that I'm about to tell all these children that I'm responsible for them eating and being able to go to the doctor. And the vast majority of them probably hadn't eaten since they had eaten at that facility the day before. and horror struck me. If it doesn't translate down to changing the experience that families have every day, changing the outcome for children, and changing their future, then we're not really being effective.
With human services and people experiencing poverty, what we learned is that Americans really share a value of human potential, which means that Americans tend to believe that everyone has potential to live a good life and that they should have the opportunity to achieve that. So that's really a powerful shared value that is quite different from, it's people's individual fault if they haven't achieved success. And so when we lead with that, as you said in the formula, it opens up the rest of the conversation.
One of the game changers in our community was to introduce the human services value curve into the narrative conversation. It really allowed us to paint the picture where everyone could see the continuing nature of the work and how all of the various systems were interwoven together into creating the kind of outcomes that we really wanted to see on the ground. When they could see their role and how they factored into the larger continuum of the whole, for us understanding how to do this work. Just being around a group of people, a group of national leaders, thought leaders who are committed to changing outcomes was critical for us.
There's probably no more important time, at least in our lifetimes, for those systems and structures to come together. And I'm thankful that we're rowing that way ahead, having built on this narrative journey together. Because I think it really has put us, as you said, Rodney, in a place where we have some common ways of thinking that have really helped us be more effective in our collective efforts together. So I want to thank both of you for joining me in a conversation, for being on the journey, and for staying on the journey as we move ahead.